Welcome back again to the panel sessions. We have a full panel presentation. We have 5 panelists, but there are 2 taped presenters. We will start also with Stefania Giannini, the Assistant Director General for Education of UNESCO, and then we will have a conversation with 3 really great panelists also. One from business, without any doubt, Laurence Debroux, until recently the Chief Financial Officer of Heineken. Then we have Katrien Termeer, who has written extensively, by the way, on wicked problems in the past, but now also represents the Social Economic Council, where she is the chair also of the committee, also guiding the governance and the international efforts of the Dutch on value chain and making the value chains more fair. And we have Professor Dirk Schoenmaker, who is a professor at RSM, but also the main author of the textbook, the key textbook on sustainable finance. But before I start opening up the session, let's have a clip where Stefania Giannini will explain her take on the topic of today. Maybe you can start the video.
Excellencies, dear participants, I regret not to being able to join you in person today for this timely conference, but I'm really honored to have the opportunity to share UNESCO's perspective as the lead UN agency for education. The 2030 Agenda is a plan for prosperity. This prosperity cannot happen without empowering people, safeguarding the planet, and widening partnerships. These universal ambitions require a radical paradigm shift, and all the more so today as we grapple with the economic, social, and educational fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. The world was off track to reach the SDGs, even before the crisis. Now we face the specter of rising poverty, inequality, unemployment, and hunger. Our planet is reaching its breaking point, so to say. We are not advocating for a return to normal, but for disruptive change we need today in how we produce, in how we consume, we live and learn. This is no longer a matter of choice. We must be very clear. Such times call for innovation, imagination, and collaboration, new kind of collaboration. UNESCO is convinced that education has a driving role to play here. The 2030 Agenda recognizes the strategic role of higher education and universities for achieving the SDGs. But for these, it also has to transform. Sustainability is somehow the engine of our future. It must become the ethos of every business school and university. A kind of ethos that fosters collaboration over competition in the search for sustainable solutions. Given the complex nature of global challenges, we need more interdisciplinary and experimental approaches centered on human well-being and environmental sustainability. Business schools groom the talents, skills, mindset to think and act sustainably, to understand complexity, to think and act differently. I commend RSM Erasmus University Rotterdam for walking the talk when it comes to integrating the SDGs into its teaching, training, and research, and providing a wide range of tools to help companies take them on board. The book you are launching today on the principles of sustainable business, a framework for corporate action on the SDGs, is a real case in point. You are also committed to applying the principles for responsible management in education, which UNESCO strongly supports. Gearing innovation towards solutions that leave no one behind and steering the transition toward zero carbon societies is profitable. Well, acting in partnership is the only way to go. System change cannot happen in silos, we know. UNESCO's Global Education Coalition is a good example of a new kind of partnership like this. Launched over 1 year in the COVID, now it has attracted so far over 170 private, public, and academic partners with the flourishing of initiatives around the globe about digital learning, skills, and training. It's about giving you solutions and assisting governments on that. Well, business is a critical partner to narrow the digital divide that has exacerbated, amplified inequalities during this pandemic. Education has to deliver the right skills for the future and be connected to real-life situations. The corporate world has an influential role to play in bridging the disconnect between school and work so that youth are equipped with the skills to create inclusive green growth. Youth see education as a top solution to solve the defining challenges of our times. This came out loud, very clear, in a recent UNESCO survey. We need universities, we need business schools, we need the corporate world to put the SDGs at the center, at the core of their business case and model. This is really the best investment they can make for prosperity. I thank you very much, and I wish you a very fruitful conference today.
Thank you very much. Let's open up the panel. I see Dirk is already there as well. I introduced all three of you already shortly, and I also invited every one of you to have a short 5-minute statement taking up the challenge of today. That is the operational challenge. We call it walking the talk. It is about sharing dilemmas. It is about taking up leadership roles and the like. And of course, what would be then the role of business schools? But of course, there's a free format. You're free to reflect on anything you feel comfortable about. So let me give first the floor to Laurence. Maybe say a few words about Heineken in the past, which I think is important to understand. Heineken is, of course, a company in a business that is not uncontroversial in a sense. On the other hand, also Heineken is one of the leading companies in the world that try to make the value chain more sustainable, involving local communities, for instance, also with health campaigns. HIV/AIDS is a famous campaign of Heineken, where you don't only look at your employees, but also at the communities in which they work. So this might be some pointers also maybe for the audience to reflect on. But of course, Laurence, you're on, please.
Thank you very much, Rob. And of course, I don't speak for Heineken because I left Heineken 3 weeks ago now, but you will recognize that a lot of what I will be saying has also been shaped in this last 6 years with Heineken, and I would say positively shaped. First of all, I want to thank you for the conference. I really enjoyed the first day. And as I was preparing for today, I really found the material super useful. And in particular, anything that's related to the Nexus approach and to the practical tools, I found very useful. So I'm very much looking forward to the book. And I came out of yesterday super energized by the mix of determination and pragmatism I felt in the calling for corporate leadership. Because we all know that corporates can be part of the issue, be it only by our negative externalities. It's great to show that we can also be part of the solution. We can help progress SDG by what we do, depending on our activity. We are in a unique position to drive and fund innovation. And I love that this is really recognized as such as a strength. And also, I strongly believe we are, as corporations, key actors in our social economic systems, social ecosystems and unique places, because in the end, the consumer is an employee, is a citizen, and directly or indirectly, whether we know it or not, is also an investor. So I really think it is super dangerous to disconnect. And whenever we don't clearly see that this is all different moments of the same lives, there is a risk of fracturing the social ecosystems and the social contracts, and therefore we would all lose. So there are chains of negative consequences. But if I stick to what the theme is today, which is practical implementation, and more specifically the very real intention realization gap and how we can bridge it, I tried to tap a bit on not only Heineken, but also my past 15 years as a CFO and the last few years board members in a number of various companies to see what's relevant here. And I would say I've chosen a few angles. And the first one, which for me is important, is where is the ambition, the SDG progress ambition rooted? External pressure, wherever I've been, has been important. When people ask you a question, your investors, NGOs, government, it also puts pressure on you, and then you move forward. However, I've only seen it stick. And that has been the last stretch of the story also with Heineken. When you are really core, where you're close to your core to your value, core to your purpose. So in defining the SDG ambition, for me, it starts with a shared reality, and we're talking about this purpose and finding the purpose of the company, and then linking everything to it. So it's not something that just the CEO, the CFO, and a few people talking externally discuss with external audiences, but it's really something that's owned internally, which is very important. The second point for me is really the path from strategy to plan. It's wonderful that so many people have committed, and we are so many people who have committed to decarbonization, to carbon neutrality by 450 or before. However, we need to know how that translates into something that's going to happen tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. And so that actually translation from strategy into plan, breaking it down, is super important, because first it ensures that we're going to get there. And it gives tools to the observer and internally and externally to measure and assess. Also, we have a role to play because, as you know, in many cases, investing early in technology is not the best thing to do from a financial point of view. You better wait until other people have invested and then the price goes down. Well, if we all do that with our beautiful promises for 40 or 50, and everyone is sitting on the fence and not investing until technology is better and prices are lower for that technology, nothing will progress. So it is a very intentional move that needs to happen, sometimes a bit counterintuitive. The next thing is a question of competence. We need to be competent, and that means bringing specialists in companies, but also that means training everyone to a minimum level and getting knowledge in the companies, in the executive teams, in the board of directors. And here business schools for me have a huge role to play because it's lifelong learning. And I would also think that alumni should be able to come back repeatedly to their alma mater to actually get updated and permanently updated on those things. Then the question of metrics. And I was smiling when I heard Peter Bakker say that accountants will save the world. And as a nerdy accountant, I'm super happy to hear that. I'm all for it. Well, accountants, that's reassuring. Accountants are supposed to provide a fair view of what's happening in the financial of the company. So it is about this true and fair view. What we want now is a true and fair view, which is more holistic. And then we turn to these people who have rigor and who know how to handle a KPI. That's amazing. Provided KPIs mean something, are traceable, auditable. So all that work on KPI, I would say, remains to be largely done in many companies. And then I come to something which is probably the most essential thing for me. We cannot oppose profitability and sustainability. I often discuss with my good friend Géraldine Machette at DSM, and their purpose-led, performance-driven mantra is something that I find very powerful. So it's dangerous. It's a mistake to oppose those two concepts. For me, it would also be a mistake to accumulate injunctions on companies without recognizing that there are dilemmas. And management is about optimization under constraints. So how do you do to make sure that it's not always the same constraint that gets adjusted? And there is one thing, I mean, you can say if you believe that you get what you pay for, then just put sustainability and ESG into the incentives of management. Not easy, not always appropriate, because you're talking short-term incentive. Even what company calls long-term incentive is very short compared to what we have to do. So that's, and also what I have seen is, I've seen that what motivates management is really more the validation of being confirmed by their board and their shareholders in their role so that they can continue to deploy the strategies, and the pure incentivization. So how do we make sure that the dialogue with shareholders also covers these topics? And here, I must say, enormous progress has been made. The roadshows of the last, I wouldn't even say 2 years, I would say 6 months to a year, I've seen investors being much more trained as well, much more to the point and precise in the question they were asking. So I think there is really hope here in having also a very rich dialogue with our shareholders so they can fully play their role. So that's that would be, so it's really a nexus. It's a system change. It's fascinating, and I think we're all in together.
Thank you, Laurence. My impression was that Peter Bakker mentioned the accountants and the saviors of the world as a sort of cynical remark, but now we might have to reconsider this.
No, I thought you had a very nice smile when you were saying it.
Thank you. Let's move on to Katrien Termeer, who's a professor in Wageningen University, but also crown member of the Social Economic Council, more or less responsible for the take of the Dutch sort of coalition, meaning not the partners, but actually the employers, the employees, and the government and society on what we want to achieve with fair trade, fair value chains, and our typical way of approaching that through governance. So, Katrien, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also thank you for inviting me on this event. And I haven't followed the other parts of the conference, so I apologize, I can't refer to that. And how you introduce me, I'm here on behalf of the Social Economic Council of the Netherlands, in which employees, employers, and experts work together. And that sounds a little bit vague, I can imagine, but that means that all our advices are supported by all the three groups of partners. For example, when I present an advice on SDGs in the parliament, then I get critical questions from members of parliament in the way that you can't require SMEs to do all that extra work. But then I won't answer myself, but then I give the floor of the person who represents the SMEs. And that's the way that you get very kind of strong position. And in daily life, I'm a professor of public administration, but it provides a lot of inspiration to link practice and theory. And as a professor, my theory is that indeed we need in-depth change, transformation, but you can only achieve it through small steps. And I think that's also what we are doing as a Social Economic Council. And then coming back to the topic of today, the SDGs, and indeed very important. And the women from UNESCO should also refer to the current COVID pandemic. And it's also what I see in our council, that at this moment, talking about SDGs for business, it's quite tough because they already have a tough time, but it has never been that important. So that's a kind of paradox. Now, then we also agree that, SDGs, it's an inspiring framework, and in words, everybody is recognizing it, but we need to accelerate it. If you look at all evaluations, we need to accelerate it. And as a council, we have written advice on it a year ago. And the key point of that advice is that we think that much can be gained by linking SDG policies to international responsible business conduct. And I will explain that a little bit further. And I think you are all familiar with international RBC based on the United Nations Guiding Principles, the UNDPs, and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And the essence of the international RBC policy is that companies perform due diligence across their entire supply chains based on 6 well-defined steps. So it's quite concrete. And then on the other hand, we have the SDGs. It's a broad, holistic framework. It inspires people, and many people adhere to it because it sounds very nice and inspiring. And also many business companies, they have it in their mission because it's a good purpose. And we, in our advice, we concluded that those SDGs, that nice words and goals, provide a global context and guidepost for that IRBC policies. And on the other hand, the IRBCs, that's also focused on risks, etc. But we think that it can help to turn the somewhat abstract SDGs into real world business practices. Because in other words, we think that the SDGs, they identify the ultimate goal of international RBC, but international RBC, it helps business to flesh out the SDGs by mitigating risks and adverse impacts and by improving all the conditions in the supply chain. And some people relate SDGs with doing good and international RBC with doing no harm. We think it are coins of the size of the same coin, so that they can reinforce each other. And we also conclude this because we have also seen that there are also some companies and they do some cherry picking of an SDG. Yeah? So, for example, let's build a nice school for our community. And on the other hand, they don't mitigate risk related to bad of to worse conditions for their workers. So it's kind of cherry picking and greenwashing. And we think that when you connect the international RBC with the strict rules and the SDG as the inspiring thing, that you can strengthen it, so they can strengthen each other. And finally, and then I will stop because I've only my 5 minutes, is that we also realize that it's not easy to do this all. So therefore, and that's also where we are involved in, we promote multi-stakeholder partnerships in which firms can jointly collaborate with NGOs on doing and performing IRBC, but also to have more impact on the grounds, because you can only realize that if you work together. So I leave it with this.
Thank you, Katrien. Lots of things to be discussed. The avoid doing harm versus doing good frame as complementary rather than opposed. I don't think anybody would disagree that we should not only do good and then then have human rights violations in your value chain. You have to combine it all. But let's move on then to the finance part. Already Laurence also referred to that. And I think I cannot think of anybody better than Dirk Schoenmaker, who is the authority in the area. So, Dirk, how can we really make the finance sector, but also the financial departments of big companies, also really invest in the SDGs?
Yeah, well, thank you, Rob, for the invitation, and for all the listeners. Rob and I are brothers in arms at the Rotterdam School of Management, because normally professors spend all this research time on high-powered articles, but we take the time to write books for our students. So Rob has his Principles of Sustainable Business. I have my book on Principles of Sustainable Finance, because we believe both that what we discuss today, we should also discuss with our students. That's how we help them to discover the new world, and not yesterday's methods, but the issues of today. And I think it is also inspiring how the young people pick it up. And your question is finance in action. And I will be in a minute specific, but let me just make the general point. And finance is about allocating capital. If we allocate more to sustainable business and less to unsustainable business, we lower the cost of capital for the front-running sustainable companies, and the lower cost of capital helps them. It accelerates. In addition, investors and banks can do engagement of voting, and I'm extremely proud of what happened over the last 2 weeks. We all know Mark van Baal from Follow This. Shell, Exxon, Chevron, investors have spoken, and it are not only the investors, they have spoken on behalf of the beneficiaries. So, for example, the pension fund for the healthcare in the Netherlands, they voted on the resolution at Shell because they think that the pensioners want to do that. My own pension fund, ABP, has not been so far yet.
Exactly. Yeah.
I expect from the pressure from everybody that they will do next year. We are not allowed to predict as economists, but but Follow This is increasing, and that shows the power of money. And I'm really proud. Also, it happened at Exxon yesterday, that finance becomes really responsible. fair to say that there are many parts of the financial system who are not doing that yet, but it is starting. And I think what the Prime Minister of Finland said, we need patience. And really, it is interesting. The dull pension funds are the leaders in patient capital. They are the voters, not these asset managers. I wouldn't name the American ones, not these short-term asset managers, but these dull pension funds. They do the voting, and I'm extremely proud of that, that we are happening. Okay, we are in the panel. So what did I pick up? I think Robert Metzger said very clearly, integrated reporting, but now is the time for integrated decision-making. And I will talk about that. Secondly, how to get out of linear thinking. And our main method in finance, net present value, is extremely linear. I think Katrien at the end said, we need to accelerate. It's going too slow. Okay, how can we help? So I think the real action is not at asset managers, the real action is in corporates. And Laurence knows that. That's where the real action is, where the externalities is, but also the solutions. And what's happening already, companies are making their mission. And what is their long-term value creation? Where do they want to go? And that's very important. I think Robert and Laurence both said that this mission is extremely important. Okay, once you have the mission, how do you get there? What we learn, the students in the current textbooks, is the net present value. So the financial rewards, the financial cash flows from a project should be net positive. Then you do it. In that way, a lot of promising, innovative, risky projects don't happen. So what you need is an investment rule where, of course, we need to take care of the financial side because you don't want to be bankrupt. But in your investment method, and now I'm coming to the integrated thinking, you need to include your social and your environmental ambitions. And the nice thing is, and that's extremely controversial, with my friends of the True Price and the Impact Institute, there are now methods that you can monetize your impact. And in that way, you can include it in your investment decision and make a decision. And for example, we all know the great example of Shell and Eneco 1 year ago. So Shell was looking at buying up Eneco, this is a green utility, but they applied the old-fashioned hurdle rate for investment, so they came to a very low valuation, and they were outbid by the Japanese. In a new thinking of a framework which I have developed, and I'm going to teach this autumn with my students, if they said, okay, we are behind on our green profile, so if we invest in green, we increase the value of the company, they would have put a higher bid for Eneco in, and they might have taken it over, and there would be closer to the 45% reduction required by the judges in The Hague. So this kind of new thinking, that if you have your mission and you invest in projects which help you out getting there by valuing your social and your environmental things, that kind of new thinking is what finance can offer. And that basically means we get outside the linear thinking of ESCO. That's the net present value rule, that we go to innovative thinking where we include the issues, measure them, and be accountable to your stakeholders, including the shareholders. So we want accountability. And my aim is to quantify it, not for the sake of quantification, but to help out accountability. Okay. So you have the dilemmas of Laurence. You can really look at them, take a decision, and then explain to your stakeholders why you took the decision. And it means new methods. And I'm looking forward to work also with business to develop these new case studies.
Okay, Dirk, I think we didn't plan exactly how many rounds of discussion we would have. Of course, it depends on the time, and the time is short. I'm looking also a little bit at the chat, what kind of questions or discussions pop up in the conversation among the audience. But let's take the last point. Maybe do a little bit recycling also of the kind of discussion we aim at, because what Dirk just mentioned at his last statement, and just to mention also, Shell didn't also try to invest in Eneco alone. They did it together with the pension fund. So that was already an interesting form of blended finance, or whatever you can call it. So isn't it true that the statement also made by Dirk, we need new models or new thinking, maybe open up thinking, is one of the most important challenges we face in practice in business, maybe also in the negotiation at the level of the Social Economic Council, in the financial department of investors. And that might be a lesson also, sort of an assignment also to the business schools to develop further. So let do a little round in the panel. Laurence, can you reflect on this, please?
I completely relate to what Dirk said about NP and about this linear thinking that we need to not to move completely out of, but use it as a point, but not make it rule all the decisions. That's the link between this kind of non-linear thinking and what actually determines the values of shares is an important one. If in between you have patient capital, that's amazing. So I've always been a big fan of company controlled or foundation controlled, but the whole world doesn't work like that. So in order to make it scalable beyond places where patient capital is in control, you need to also make sure that actually that cascades into the valuation of company. And there is a bit of a missing link for me, and something that I'm not sure, whatever the goodwill of all the asset managers that I speak to is, and I meet excellent people, when the share price goes one way or another, because a lot of the trading is algorithmic and whatever, then you get to actually a tension point. So how that link can happen, I know the European Central Bank has some plans to actually increase the level of collateral, for instance, for companies, for shares that would be deposited with them and that do not meet their green. There are lots of good ideas. For me, it's a crucial point and it's unresolved.
Is there any sort of experience that you can share as being the CFO of Heineken? I suppose you have been struggling with this, the dilemma that Dirk also says, you have net present value, you have investors, of course, shareholders that want to go for short-term returns. Within that sort of jungle of short-term expectations and metrics that might not be useful for a company like Heineken to really become purpose-driven, how did you deal with that in the past 10 years?
I've not been very brave because I've actually only worked in family-controlled companies, and I'm a board member in family or foundation-controlled companies.
Okay.
So I've chosen my camp, but I would say when you have a stable shareholding that says we are behind you and we support that strategy, then you only attract other shareholders that know what they are entering. So they come if they agree with the strategy or if they agree with the approach, and that makes it easier. So I do not have a solution for companies that would be more kind of like open door with only small and maybe a lot of short-term shareholders. I do not have that.
Can I make a suggestion, Rob? I think what happened at Danone, because it was a one-sided financial metric, and on that metric, the CEO has been fired. And if there would have been a better metric of integrated value, then I don't know, maybe even then he would have not enough delivered, I don't know. But if at least we had the honest measure of long-term value where we integrate the other parts, then at least you could have had an honest discussion whether there was under or over performance, because if there's underperformance, yes, it is a hard world. But now we only had a financial metric, and I really felt sorry for him. And I think there's a need for an integrated metric to have a fairer accountability.
Okay, I see you, Laurence. Maybe you respond to this.
I think it's very important what you're saying, Dirk. And you know what you see in some cases, and I don't want to talk to specific cases, but Danone was not the first one, is that when the CEO gets fired for alleged or real underperformance, then the fact that he was actually a proponent of SDG and so on almost backfires. You know, the moment your performance is lower, if you've been too visible advocating that, and it's not the first time we see it. So it's super important to integrate it. Otherwise, it is like it's only if I'm super successful that I can afford to actually speak up on those topics, which shouldn't be the case. It should be all the time front and center of the discussion.
Okay, let's get Katrien involved, because from the platform of the Dutch so-called the negotiation system, I suppose that these discussions also on, call it the perverse incentive of the financial system, or the wrong metrics, or just integrating enough sort of value dimension into what you look at business models, might be something you have been discussing. So what is the take of the Social Economic Council on this?
We totally agree that the linear way of thinking need to be changed, but also that's quite difficult, huh?
Yeah.
Because then we have some thinking exercises, okay, but what does it mean? Huh? Do we still have procurement, for example, in a circular economy or not? So how radical do we want to make it? So that's part. Another part is that, okay, we are talking about transformation, etc. But, and that's also related to my own research, that we think that, okay, but let's get started. We can talk about it a lot, but let's get started. And then it's interesting, Laurence, that you were also, of course, Heineken, referring to family farms of business. And we have invited many persons from family business to convince other business companies, because they have, it's part of their identity that they have a kind of moral leadership, so to say. It's a big word, but in doing so, they can inspire. So what we are trying to do in the Social Economic Council, of course, we have all our nice ideas, but we always try to experiment and to show that it's possible. Otherwise, you get empty talking, and doesn't make sense. But there's also, of course, a critical note, because we are Social Economic Council, we are also compromising, we are poldering, and some people say you don't go fast enough, but we think that the focus is on the in-depth change, so really organizing impact on the floor in other countries. So, and with that in mind, we think, okay, then it's okay to do those small steps. And then when I go to metrics, then I'm a little bit familiar with it. As a professor, I've written a paper with a title, The Evaluation Paradox of Wicked Problems, because current evaluation systems do not help to evaluate progress of wicked problems. Indeed, of the opposite, they can even worsen the problem because you don't meet the criteria. But I have also a nuanced answer, because, and then I go back to our advice, the 6 steps of due diligence, people say, oh, it's only checking the box. So it's only it's a linear structure. But we think that's our experience when you organize those steps in multi-stakeholder platform, that it goes beyond ticking the box, because then you internalize it, start talking about it, and in particular the final steps, if you're really to organize impact on the ground, then it goes beyond ticking the box. So that I believe that some linear metrics in the end can trigger transformative change.
Okay, Katrien. Now I am in a very difficult position now. I would love to continue the conversation, because I think we're getting somewhere anyway, which also means more than just a few remarks and a discussion. However, I also hope that you realize that we don't organize this conference as a sort of, well, now we discuss everything and then we come to a conclusion and everything is okay. No, actually, the whole conference has been aimed at starting up a conversation. Also showing that we as a business school are not afraid of wicked problems, systemic change, leadership, and opening up the discussion. So actually, that is what happened this moment also. That's what happened in the keynotes and in the panel. It happened also yesterday. So I hope our esteemed panel is not insulted that I'm now wrapping up. And I'm also asking, and also thank you also for your candid also contributions. And I hope, of course, that this will be a continuous conversation, and we'll make sure that we keep you on topic also as well. So, but for the moment, I wrap up the panel. I can ask also my technical assistant to show the next slide, because now I'm going to explain what we're going to do after the break, and I'm going to introduce the final statement, which is of the former Prime Minister of South Korea, Prime Minister Han, who has also been the climate change envoy of the United Nations. And he has a bit longer message. So what we will do is also to start the tape, and then you feel free also then at the end to still have a little break. But we will reconvene exactly at 4:45 with this. We have 3 breakout sessions where we deal with some of the topics that have been discussed. We call the transition challenges, the metrics challenge, and the training and education challenge. The transition challenge is about how to define where you are as a company, where to go to. We call that the better business scan, and it is also shared with you the experience of many companies and a lot of the platforms also that are supporting this, including practitioners, but also changing the digital platform. Then the metrics challenge is headed by the Wage Indicator Foundation, and they zoom in this jungle of many metrics, one most important metric, and I really support that. That is living wage. So that session is also very interesting to see what that means in practice, with a lot of practitioners, including Philips and another number of other big companies, how you can make that work, and also walk the talk. And finally, of course, the training and education challenge, where we really want to share with you also the kind of training, not only that is pioneered by RSM, but also by the SDG Academy. So it's a dual presentation and an experience session where you're all welcome to participate. Next slide, please, and then I will introduce Prime Minister Han. That, of course, leads at the end of that session to a number of major booths. We already created that yesterday, but just to give you an idea, after the final breakout sessions, you can still also plug into the expo room. And in the expo room, there are a number of booths where you can link up to. The Club de Madrid, for instance, so the representative of former prime minister and presidents, they're there, and they are going to share information with you, but also maybe enter into discussion. The same applies for the SDG traineeship project, which is a great initiative also in the Netherlands of getting students or former students aligned with possible beneficiaries and companies, governments, and the like. And the same is true for Tosca and other platforms that also are trying to really speed up the SDG agenda. And of course, we have the Better Business Scan that also is something that has been now pioneered in the Netherlands for more than 1,200 people filling out that scan and really profiting from that also to walk the talk. Anyway, wrapping up this, I'd like to give the floor now to Prime Minister Han, who is being so kind also to tape his speech in order also to give us a little bit of the flexibility in our session. For everyone that wants to follow this speech, please stay tuned. And for everyone that wants to go to the breakout rooms, you only can get into breakout rooms 5 minutes in advance. So the next 10 minutes, please notice Prime Minister Han. Thank you very much.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to take part in this symposium on behalf of the Club de Madrid and wish to thank the organizer for their kind invitation. I'm delighted to share the podium with a group of distinguished participants, but at the same time, I'm very sorry that I'm not able to take part in the final discussion due to the time difference between the Netherlands and Korea. Before I start on a very serious topic on SDGs and ESG, let me say a few episodes on my experience as the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General for Climate Change. I was appointed as the Special Envoy together with Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway, and Ricardo Lagos, former President of Chile, in 2007. That was the year when the COP13 was to be held in Bali, Indonesia in November. Our mission was to make the COP13 a success. Therefore, 3 of us was assigned to the region we are from, Brundtland to Europe, Laos to Americas, and I to Asia and the Pacific. Each of us traveled extensively to solicit the support from the leaders and encourage them to take active part in making the success of the COP13. We were even invited by the US Congress to testify. At the time, as it is now, US Congress was completely divided along the political lines. Democrats in favor of action to tackle climate change, whereas Republicans were against it. Although we were actively participated in the hearing, we were not able to persuade any single Republican representative to cross the bench. The chief delegates from the government to the Conference of the Parties, COP, have always been the ministers in charge of environmental issues. However, as the climate change action requires budgets and financial resource mobilizations, ministers responsible for finance play a critical role in mainstreaming climate change in national budget and implementing policy actions. Therefore, I suggested to hold finance ministers meeting at the time of COP13 in addition to that of the environment ministers. We succeeded in persuading the government to have the meeting of the finance ministers in Bali at the time of COP13 for the very first time. Ever since the COP13, unfortunately, there have been no finance ministers meeting held during the COP. The COP13 in Bali was one of the most successful conferences. At the meeting, Kevin Rudd, who was just elected as the Prime Minister of Australia, delivered a speech that Australia would ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and he received a standing ovation from the world community at the time. I was also heavily involved in promoting the UN Global Compact principles and initiatives in Korea. Korea started from almost none in the early 2000s, but grew into one of the top 10 best performing networks in the Global Compact, whose network exceeded 285 by the year 2015. The UN Global Compact started in 2000 was soon followed by the Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI, in 2005. The PRI began to work on the sustainable global financial system and encouraged the adoption of the principles by fostering good governance, integrity, and accountability. United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, UNEP-FI, is a good example of a unique partnership between UNEP and the global financial sector. I am of the view that, broadly speaking, the MDGs was a precursor to the SDGs, and so were the UN Global Compact and UNEP-PRI to ESG. Ladies and gentlemen, Sustainable Global Goals, Development Goals, SDG, was set up by the United Nations General Assembly in September 2015. Since then, many companies have incorporated the SDGs into their corporate mission and strategies. A business leader has to manage a transformational change and to develop a systematic view of change. But we all know that since a gap always exists between intention and realization, what is more important is to implement a strategy than to establish a sustainable strategy. The private sector's own interpretation of SDGs could be explained by the environmental, social, and corporate governance, ESG for short. The PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, is a framework developed by and for investors to improve the analysis of ESG issues in the investment process for social impact investment of a company. Let me give a case in Korea. The ESG framework has been already incorporated into the main investment organizations like Korea Investment Corporation, KIC. KIC, founded in 2005 to increase national wealth and contribute to the growth of Korea's finance industry, manages assets entrusted by the Korean government, Bank of Korea, and public funds. KIC has established ESG approaches suitable for traditional and alternative assets, as well as direct and indirect investment, and is entrusted with the proceeds of the government's green and sustainability bond to invest in green and social projects. KIC examines and discloses the environmental and social impact of each investment, including reductions in greenhouse gases emissions, energy savings, renewable energy generation, and job creation. For the private sector, companies may search for relevant SDGs within the ESG framework, which align with their corporate goals and capacity. When a firm scrutinizes the possible cost, expected benefits, and potential external effects, it may also assess its intention realization gap and have a chance to develop better strategies. There are certain challenges to overcome when putting sustainability ideas into practice and achieving a systematic change to go beyond their usual businesses. Companies have internal and external pressures to achieve sustainability and at the same time to solve various challenges that may arise. The first challenge is that pace of management changeover is getting faster and faster. Progress on sustainability takes time and focus on companies' long-term growth. Although CEOs always emphasize the long-term vision, the decisions they make are often short-term based and more focused on present-day concerns. To overcome this short-termism, CEOs should broaden their horizons beyond finance to reflect the company's true value and vision. This will help them to set realistic targets aligned with the SDGs. The second challenge arises when there is no standard or set of rules for a company. Companies operating in different sectors experience different types of risks and crises, but are asked to incorporate sustainability strategies into their overall strategy. Since there are no standards, each company has no choice but to make judgments based on their own standards. Under these circumstances, it is difficult to know how well a company is heading towards accomplishing sustainable development goals. The third challenge is that it is necessary for a firm to define strategic and operational principles for sustainable business models and practices that will frame how strategy formulation and implementation processes can be linked to the SDGs. Strategic and operational questions for private organization would boil down to specific questions. How can strategic partnership with the other stakeholders help achieve the SDGs through ESG-related activities? The private organizations should answer such questions with a comprehensive framework and strategic principles of sustainable business. The last challenge is that stakeholders such as customers, shareholders, executives and employees, government and regional communities are increasingly expecting and demanding companies to promote SDGs across all business activities. Ladies and gentlemen, SK Group is an good example of a Korean company that has recognized early the importance of making a collective impact to address complex social needs. SK Group is keen to establish a system for measuring and compensating performance of social enterprise in our society, and to activate an ecosystem of social enterprises through influx of investment and recruitment of outstanding competent personnel. Meanwhile, investment related to sustainable finance, such as issuance of green, social, and sustainable funds, have become increasingly prevalent, and investors are actively making responsible investment. For example, Korea's National Pension Service announced this year that it would invest 50% of its total assets in the aforementioned areas by 2022, emphasizing the importance of incorporating ESG and sustainable development issues in investment decision-making processes. The role of government to help the private sector to achieve SDG is to present the direction and target in a large framework. This will facilitate and enable leading companies to successfully convert their sustainable vision to actual business practices. In a world with greater threat from climate change, the government should present a guideline of greenhouse gas reduction targets by sector in a larger framework. The government should also act as a guide on who should be responsible for how much and adjust the proportion of energy sources, for example, among new and renewable energies and nuclear power. Such regulations may pose a challenge and burden for unprepared companies, but prepared and flexible companies would be able to take an advantage of future market opportunities. Because both sustainability and global trends are so closely intertwined in general, there are numerous tangible benefits for the companies, such as lowering costs, controlling risks and responsibilities, improving quality, creating a healthy work environment, motivating employees, and increasing morale. Only what is measured can be managed. So it is important for companies to build a systematic framework for measurement and monitoring to get accurate information on which areas to improve. I would like to recommend the companies to engage locally in the application of international norms in policy discussions as a starting place for dialogue and to create collaboration platforms. Active capacity building and local ownership in decision-making will enable companies to realize an achievable standard for sustainable growth and to share information on value creation. Whether a company wants it or not, an increasing number of stakeholders are asking for a company's response and action to SDGs. In other words, there is a growing body of support for impact investment and ESG investment. With expanding support and endorsement from investors, companies should invest and execute sustainable practices toward the process of transition to systematic and inclusive change with a commitment to leaving no one behind. Thank you for your attention.